Hi everyone and welcome back to lecture. Today we're going to turn our attention to opiate-based drugs and the many dangers that these drugs pose to us. As you're probably aware, we're currently in the midst of an opioid crisis in this country. Some may choose not to recognize this crisis for what it really is, but there truly is a crisis happening today, and it's not going away without some true legal changes to the system. Let's go ahead and get started on today's discussion. In this chapter, as I've said, we're discussing drugs that are derived from opium. So what drugs are really derived from opium? So we have pure opium, obviously, and then we have drugs like morphine, heroin, methadone, oxycodone, hydrocodone, and codeine, just to name a few. Opium comes from the poppy plant, as you can see from your screen. There are a few variations on the poppy plant. Some will give you opium and some will not. Poppy seeds, like those found in bagels and breads, do contain small amounts of opium and have a morphine-like effect, but it's very subtle. This is not enough to be concerning, and it's not enough that you would even feel. But if you do eat enough of them, you might not pass a drug test. That's not a myth. You can make poppy seed tea out of them, and you can even soak the poppy seeds long enough to make the beverage. You need to soak a couple pounds of poppy seeds and then drink quite a bit of the tea to actually achieve any sort of therapeutic effect. Where does the opium poppy have its roots? What part of the world do we see the majority of them being grown in? Asian countries and Middle Eastern countries, but the biggest country that we historically associate with opium poppies is China. We often credit the Chinese culture with the large influx of the initial large influx of opium-based drugs into the United States. On your screen, you see a picture of an opium poppy that is about to be harvested. You can make little cuts up the side of the poppy seed pod, and then you'll get this sort of white-looking liquid that's coming out, as you can see here. A harvester has to let the poppy drain for a little while and then starts to scoop it out. The white liquid you see on your screen is pure opium. As opium is exposed to air, it starts to dry. When it dries, it changes colors and goes from white to this reddish-brown sort of color. This is called opium gum due to its texture and its consistency. This is a picture of an opium harvester collecting opium that has already been released from the poppy. They will then take the gum out and allow it to dry even more. A calcium solution and hot water is added to the opium gum and stirred, and then you have to let it sit for a while longer. Once it sits for a while, the compound starts to separate and you get a clear liquid that sits on the top. That's the morphine that will be later refined for medical purposes. Once you siphon all of that liquid out, you have to add a binding chemical to the mix, and you have to apply some sort of heat source. After you heat it up, the liquid turns into a solid for the most part. You need to drain any remnants of the liquid from the residue and let it dry in the sun. Break it all apart and you will have a brown morphine base. Then you need to add more chemicals to it and the morphine base will turn almost black in color. Cool it down and filter it with water to remove all of the impurities you see here. This powder that you see on your screen, this is sodium carbonate. You have to add water to this, mix it in with the morphine base that was just created, and you will now have a heroin base. This black mixture is the heroin base. Charcoal and more water was added. Then you have to filter out the majority of the charcoal to remove these impurities. Then you dry the mixture out, and what you have done is successfully created black tar heroin. Once all of the charcoal is filtered and the mixture is dry, you add some remaining chemicals that help to break up the heroin mixture into a more powdered consistency. Then you need to filter it at least one more time. Your final result is dry, powdered heroin, ready to be cooked, snorted, smoked, or injected. As you can see here, these three pictures on your screen are an individual. Let me go back so you can see the process again. This is powdered heroin that has been placed on a spoon. It's being heated up. As you heat it, it turns more brown in color, and then it's ready to be pulled into a syringe to be injected into the user. There's the heroin, and off we go. Once all of the abuse rate has gone up in this country due to high increases in prescriptions being issued for hydrocodone and oxycodone pills, among other opiate-based prescriptions. Oxycodone was first developed by Bayer in 1917. Good old Bayer Pharmaceuticals keeps popping up again and again in this semester. They created oxycodone because heroin was becoming a problem in Germany. Heroin was created by Bayer because morphine was becoming a problem before that. So what you're really seeing is a progressive effect in which opioids are becoming problematic, and pharmaceutical companies are simply creating a replacement drug that's as bad, if not worse, than the one that came before it. So oxycodone was created in the early 1900s, but was not approved for use in the United States until 1995, when the FDA approved its use. It's a very popular drug and is primarily used in 3 different areas. The first area these oxycodone drugs are prescribed for is to create an analgesic effect. And an analgesic effect basically means it's a pain reliever. This is the primary, this area is the primary reason in which these medications are so oftenly prescribed. However, there are 2 more uses. These drugs can also be used as an antitussive, meaning it's a cough medicine or a cough suppressant, and an antidiarrheal drug, and that itself is pretty self-explanatory. But then I ask you, why do I have antidiarrheal highlighted on your screen? Those who are using narcotics are constantly constipated. It's one of the most common side effects for all narcotic users. So if there's someone out there that has severe stomach issues, including chronic issues with diarrhea, then they can be prescribed a low-dose opioid-based prescription medication that helps with that issue. It's not very commonly done, but it does happen. So let's go ahead and discuss some of the pharmacological effects of taking some sort of opiate drug. As we said before, opioids are mainly used for analgesic purposes. Trying to alleviate the pain means releasing endorphins either naturally or through the use of narcotic opioids, essentially turns off the parts of the brain that perceive pain. That's why when you're injured, sometimes your body doesn't actually feel it at first. Endorphins and adrenaline have been released, and the shock of the situation has turned off your pain receptors. Once that shock wears off, the pain hits you head on. The same thing happens when you take an opiate product. This map of the body shows us where opioid receptors are and where the pain triggers are turned off. Endorphins are released in the brain and turn off your pain receptors. Opiates in the brainstem essentially relax you and decrease your breathing. They turn off the neurons that control respiration. That's the issue that we see most commonly in terms of overdose. In the spinal cord, opiates are once again turning off the pain receptors present in the spinal cord. Peripheral neurons are connected to the spinal cord, and they send messages back and forth. The spinal cord tells the peripheral nerves that there is no pain to register. And in your intestines, one of the biggest issues with the buildup of these opioids involving the intestine is the constipation issue that we were discussing previously. Morphine is considered the big daddy of them all. It's only available in hospitals, and it's the good stuff that you'll get after something major has occurred. It's most commonly injected either with a hypodermic needle. It can be added to your IV solution, and additionally, it could be administered to you sublingually, meaning that it's administered underneath the tongue and you let it dissolve. But it's not as commonly administered that way. Morphine can also come in pill form, and that allows the user to be able to snort it or smoke it in addition to simply swallowing the pill. But this substance is controlled for the most part, so you're getting morphine in the hospital or in hospice for end-of-life care. If you receive morphine for pain, you normally only receive it for a few days at most. While you're in the hospital, the doctors typically start to wean you off of the morphine even before you leave. This means switching you to a different type of pain reliever, which would also maybe be an opioid, but not always. Morphine has a very high abuse potential, and therefore they typically only prescribe it for individuals with higher levels of pain or more traumatic injuries. If you receive morphine for pain, you normally only receive it for a few days at most. If you have had a previous dependence or addiction to an opiate-based medication, then sometimes the doctors won't give you morphine at all and instead will give you a different type of pain medication in the hospital so that you are not triggering that addiction potential again. No matter what you take, there's going to be side effects to the drug. Remember that all narcotic opioids are still depressants, so you're going to experience things like drowsiness and mental clouding, respiratory depression. This means slow and shallow breathing. And as I said before, this is the worrisome one. Your brainstem turns off the pain receptors when opioids are administered and also helps to relax you and decrease your breathing. And this is where the majority of overdoses come from. Your body gets so relaxed with higher doses of opiate narcotics that your body forgets to breathe, but it is so relaxed that it will not gasp for air. This is basically what happens during physician-assisted suicide. You may also experience nausea, vomiting, and constipation, inability to urinate, and drops in blood pressure. These are all worrisome signs, but also quite consistent with other types of depressant drugs. The potential for abuse is so high and so quick that these drugs are some of the most common ones we become addicted to. Part of the reason for it is the abundance of prescriptions that have been provided to patients over the last decades. Doctors would hand them out like candy when oxycodone initially received FDA approval. Given the quick addiction rate, many of these drugs are often scheduled as a 1 or a 2, but there are some 3s out there as well. So what besides addiction should we be worried about? First, it's tolerance. Tolerance occurs quickly when there are high doses administered in a short amount of time. When we become tolerant to a drug, it means that our body needs a higher dose in order for the medication to be effective. The higher the dose and the more frequently we take the medication, the faster we are going to get to dependence and tolerance. So what would be considered a Schedule I drug? Heroin is the only one in the opiate-based group that is a Schedule I because it has no recognized medicinal value. Drugs in Schedule II include morphine, methadone, codeine, and pure opium. Schedule III drugs include codeine when it's mixed with something like Tylenol or a codeine that is in different types of cough medicines. Let's focus our attention on heroin for a bit. Heroin is such a problematic street drug and is causing so much harm right now, it's crazy. Remember, as we just said, there's no medicinal use for heroin, which makes it a Schedule I drug. But it's amazingly popular and accounts for more than $120 billion in sales every year. Behind marijuana, heroin is the second most frequently used drug in the United States. It's cheap, it's fast acting, and for users, it's good quality for the price. We've had a huge influx of heroin over the years, and in the last 2 decades, it has overtaken cocaine in terms of popularity. So where does it all come from? During the 1970s, most of the heroin used in the United States came from the Golden Triangle. This is an area in Southeast Asia, which includes Burma, Thailand, and Laos. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, heroin predominantly came from Mexico, and today it's largely coming from Afghanistan. Pure heroin is a brilliantly white color. Anytime heroin comes in different colors, it's because there are impurities in the powder, meaning it was cut with something else. So what would you cut heroin with? In cutting heroin and other types of drugs, you're basically wanting to stretch out the heroin and you're bulking it up. By bulking up the heroin, you are able to sell more to more users. Lactose does not have much interaction at all with heroin, and it's safe to cut with. For those of you who don't know what lactose is, it's basically powdered milk. There are other things that you can cut heroin with, and that would make it worse. Depending on what you cut it with, it can have an impact on the strength of the heroin itself. Black tar heroin is considered really bad, really cheap, basically just shitty heroin. But it's cheaper and it's easier to get in some areas compared to pure powder heroin. But it hasn't been distilled yet, so you're putting a lot more contaminants in your body in addition to the actual drug. Black tar heroin happens when you grind it into a powder form. This is one of the more popular ways of consuming black tar for those who don't like to use needles. Black tar heroin is put into some sort of blender and it's mixed again with lactose. This creates a fine powdered product that can be snorted very easily. You can also consume black tar through a process called water looping. Water looping is when a user places the heroin into an empty eyedropper bottle or a syringe that has had the needle removed. The user allows the heroin to completely dissolve into water and the solution is then dropped into the nose. This at times can be wasteful if a user uses too much and allows the solution to go down their throat. There's also a process called vaporizing, or more commonly it's known as chasing the dragon. A user puts the heroin into a piece of tinfoil and heats the tinfoil with a lighter underneath it. The user then uses a straw or something similar to inhale the vapor. You can also drink your heroin. You probably didn't know this, but you can. It's less common to do it this way due to the wastefulness of the drug, but it's done similarly to the water looping method. Instead of being delivered through the nose, the solution is simply swallowed once the heroin is dissolved into the water. You can also administer heroin through the use of a suppository. The most effective route of administration, which does not require a needle, is accomplished by delivering a solution via syringe with no needle or a lubricated mass of the narcotic deep into your rectum or vagina. People who intravenously inject black tar heroin are at much higher risk of venous sclerosis than those who are injecting powder heroin. In this condition, the veins narrow and harden, which makes repeated injection in that site nearly impossible. Researchers have found that the rapidity with which black tar heroin destroys your veins, along with its gummier consistency, may put people who inject it at a lower risk of HIV infection because they are forced to inject subcutaneously rather than into their veins. And needles must be thoroughly rinsed free of black tar between injections if new sterilized ones are not available. At least one study has drawn attention to lower HIV rates, infection rates among drug users in which black tar heroin is the major form of street available heroin, suggesting that this may be due to the need to heat black tar heroin to dissolve it, which also inactivates any HIV present in the solution. However, black tar heroin injectors can be at increased risk of life-threatening bacterial infections, in particular necrotizing soft tissue infections. The practice of skin popping or subcutaneous injection predisposes the user to necrotizing fasciitis or necrotizing cellulitis. Black tar heroin injection can also be associated with botulism infections. As I mentioned earlier, heroin is quite cheap these days and is pretty strong in quality. But in order for the dealers to make more money, they cut it, making it stretch out more and more so they can sell more to different users. So when they cut it, these different chemicals are referred to as cutting agents, and they can include caffeine, chloroquine, and paracetamol. Caffeine, for example, causes heroin to vaporize at a lower temperature, and that may be seen by heroin users who smoke or inhale heroin as a practical benefit of mixing the two substances. Chloroquine is known as an anti-malarial drug and has been used as a cutting agent for heroin for years, although it was not previously known to be used in Afghanistan. Chloroquine does not alter the effects of heroin or influence the way in which it is consumed. Its widespread availability, low price, color, and crystalline structure are thought to be some of the reasons for its use. And then since you're taking different doses of heroin trying to find the right high, your purity level may be different depending on what the drug is actually cut with. Even though you're taking the same dose, you might have a different interaction. And that's one of the biggest problems that happens when we have people using heroin and they have no idea what it's cut with. Heroin has a bitter taste and is often cut with quinine, which is a little bit different than chloroquine, but it still can result in a deadly combination. Quinine on its own is quite bitter, so you don't really realize that it's in the drug. Quinine was also used as an anti-malarial drug similar to chloroquine, and was used as the first line of defense against malaria up until 2006 in developing countries. You can also find quinine in smaller amounts in tonic water. It's what gives the tonic water its slightly bitter taste. If you get a bottle of tonic water and you put a black light on behind it, you're going to see that the tonic water, will glow in the dark. That's actually the quinine that is glowing. So if you put your quinine in heroin, it's going to help mask the fact that you cut the heroin down in any way in terms of strength, because both drugs are quite bitter. Fentanyl is a synthetic opiate that is very similar but actually more potent than morphine. It is typically used to treat patients with very severe pain, or it's used to manage pain after very large surgeries. It's also sometimes used to treat people with chronic pain who are physically tolerant to opiates. It's a Schedule II prescription drug. The problem here is that if you do cut your heroin with fentanyl, you're taking two very strong, powerful opioids together, and it's causing a synergistic effect, which basically means there's a high probability for an easy overdose. If you don't know what's in it, then it's really easy to take too much at one time because you're expecting something different to occur. As heroin is a depressant, some users enjoy drinking alcohol with their heroin as a way to enhance the effects of the heroin itself. Some users take a different route and instead will mix a depressant with a stimulant. If that stimulant is cocaine, then we call that process speedballing. Speedballing occurs in which cocaine acts as a stimulant and heroin or morphine will act as a depressant. Administering the two drugs together is meant to provide an intense rush of euphoria with a high that is supposed to combine the effects of both drugs, while hoping to reduce the negative effects such as anxiety, hypertension, palpitations, and other common side effects of stimulants and the sedation effects of the depressant. You can speedball in one of two ways. You can mix the two drugs together and cook them down together, then inject them at the same time in the same needle. Or you can cook them separately and inject them into two different arms. This is a very quick way to overdose, and there have been some very popular celebrities who have overdosed due to speedballing. This includes Chris Farley from Saturday Night Live, actor Philip Seymour Hoffman, actor River Phoenix, John Belushi, Chris Kelly from Criss Cross, and Mitch Hedberg. Most heroin users actually begin their journey with heroin by snorting. You can take smaller amounts at first and learn your tolerance level. Then most heroin users graduate into actually injecting the drug. You can inject it directly into your muscle, and that we call it intramuscular use. But it's doing it this way is going to take longer for the heroin to get into your system compared to if you just directly inject it into your veins. If you put it in your muscles rather than your veins and you do it intramuscularly, this is called skin popping, as I referred to before. If you're going to smoke heroin, you're going to need a pipe. You heat the heroin to get the smoke going, and then you inhale the smoke. It's very similar to how you would smoke crack. But you need to get the heroin into little chunks or little balls so that you can heat just a little bit at a time. Mainlining is what occurs when you directly inject into your veins. You need to add water to the powder and cook it down into a liquid state. You need to make sure that there's absolutely no powder left. You need just a little bit of water mixed in with your heroin to do this. You cook it on a spoon and then drag it into the needle, making sure that there are no air bubbles at all in the syringe, and then you inject it directly into your veins. So what's the problem with injecting it directly into your veins? A few issues commonly occur with intravenous drug users. Every time you inject a needle into your veins, you're basically building up a small amount of scar tissue in the area that you inject in. If you keep injecting into the same vein, eventually it's going to collapse. Then you can no longer use the vein, and it results in track marks. Users will find the small veins between their fingers and their toes, or sometimes they'll even go under their tongue if they're desperate enough. One of the side effects of this is that anytime you have an inmate who is facing the death penalty that used to be an intravenous drug user, when this occurs, the executions are sometimes botched because the executioners have trouble finding a usable vein for the inmate that they are trying to execute. The biggest issue with heroin users is the idea of shared needles, beyond obviously the idea of them using heroin. Many countries in Europe have started using needle exchanges so that users can have clean needles if they're going to use. This idea has been promoted in the United States at several points over the last couple decades, but nobody seems to really want to jump on this idea. Kentucky in the last couple of years has had a really big increase in the number of HIV and AIDS cases that they're seeing from users who are using unclean needles and needle sharing. And basically needle sharing is what's happening when I use a dirty needle and then I give it to you and you use the same dirty needle. You're basically passing a bunch of junk back and forth between you guys. So what's happening is when these individuals are contracting HIV/AIDS, they're sometimes getting arrested for the drug use or possession of the narcotic. They're going to jails and correctional facilities, and then they're basically passing it on to everybody else because, as we know, drug use does not stop once you are incarcerated. Okay, so even though we don't have true needle exchange programs, there are programs in the U.S. that are rather covert in nature, and in 48 states they do have programs out there that let you walk into a pharmacy and basically you can purchase a hypodermic needle without a prescription. The problem is that there is a cap on the number of needles that you're able to purchase before it becomes a bigger concern. So these programs that do allow for needle exchange do wonders for HIV and AIDS rates in areas that have these programs. And once you get rid of them, once you get rid of the needle exchange programs, for example, you're running into some of the problems that Kentucky is having right now. So in terms of cost, it costs about $1 for a clean needle to be provided to somebody without a prescription. But it costs roughly $36 a day for HIV medication. But many heroin users don't have insurance, so guess who's going to be taking care of that bill if they're being treated for HIV? So from a taxpayer perspective, what sounds like the better option? Some people are so scared about contracting HIV that they either smoke the heroin or they'll snort it. It's not as effective to smoke it or snort it, so it's only a matter of time before they start injecting or they return to injecting. And this is basically going to happen regardless of whether or not you want to believe in needle exchanges. So some people just err on the side of caution in terms of budgetary requirements, and they say, well, $1 is a heck of a lot cheaper than $36, so let's go down that route. Tolerance begins with the first dose, but the first dose really isn't ever all that pleasant for users. Commonly, there's a lot of nausea and vomiting involved, but if you can get past that part, then the high from heroin is quite pleasant, as users describe. But then coming off of heroin is not so fun, so you take another dose and then you start to come down more, and you take another dose, and so on and so on. Withdrawal can kick in pretty fast, in about 4 to 6 hours. This means that heroin users are having to use at least several times a day in order to ward off the withdrawal. But once they stop, the withdrawal can be quite severe. Heroin withdrawal will kill you, absolutely kill you, if you do it cold turkey. Depending on how addicted you are to the substance, you might need to go into some sort of treatment facility, but nobody recommends that you try and withdraw from heroin yourself, going the cold turkey route. Some heroin users actually turn to cocaine in an effort to try and wean themselves off the heroin. Withdrawal symptoms can include runny nose and fever, tears, meaning I'm sure that if you feel this way, you're going to want to cry too, stomach cramps and muscle spasms, along with a variety of other stomach-related issues such as vomiting and diarrhea. With all of this happening, you're not hungry in any way, and you often feel cold with an intense amount of pain radiating throughout your body. Heroin users describe the withdrawal process as one of the most painful and difficult things they've ever been through in their entire lives. So if you're smart and you're trying to get off of heroin, you might go to a methadone clinic. We actually have one here in town, and most insurance companies do cover this type of therapy. You need to get a prescription to receive methadone, though. There's often an on-site physician who could do that for you. There are both public and private methadone clinics. The greatest concentration of clinics is in California, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. How does it work? Methadone is basically a lower dose opioid which takes the place of heroin in your system. It will allow you to get off of the heroin while still feeding your body the opioid that it needs. Then you are slowly weaned off of methadone so that withdrawal is not fatal or really debilitating. This final slide shows the treatment plan for many heroin users. As you can see from this chart, the promise of relapse is built into the treatment plan. Many heroin users will relapse in their attempts to get clean. Even if they make it out of the physical dependence on heroin stage, the mental dependence is still there. Heroin users claim that they've never felt better in their lives than how they did while they were high on heroin. The memory of that feeling remains, and if you can remember that euphoria, you often want that feeling back. So relapse is almost certain for many. So the treatment plan includes steps to help with relapse and to keep users on the right pathway. This includes methadone maintenance, and some individuals who are on methadone stay on methadone for the rest of their lives, trying to keep the cravings away and keep their bodies level from the heroin withdrawal. Hopefully this lecture showed you just a little bit of some of the dangers and realities surrounding opiate and heroin use in the United States today. There's an epidemic occurring, as we stated earlier, and prescription opiates are often thought of as the gateway drug to heroin in the United States. Next time we're going to focus on stimulants and the effects that they have on our bodies. Meet me back here next time when we tackle that topic. Thank you all for your time and attention, and I hope you have a great day. Bye!